Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something that's been romanticized, mythologized, and misunderstood for over 1,000 years. Viking warfare. Not the Hollywood version, with berserkers screaming and axes flying everywhere, but the actual reality of how Vikings fought, trained, strategized, and survived in an age where combat was personal, brutal, and utterly unforgiving. So settle in, grab a drink, and if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into history, go ahead and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's step back into a world where your survival depended on your shield, your sword arm, and your willingness to stand in a line of men while death came rushing at you. The making of a warrior. Training from childhood. A Viking warrior wasn't born on the battlefield. He was forged over years, starting in childhood through a culture that valued martial skill as much as farming or sailing. The training was informal, brutal, and began almost as soon as a boy could walk. Young boys, from about age 5 or 6, would start with wooden weapons, swords, axes, and shields carved from scrap wood or shaped from branches. These weren't toys in the modern sense. They were training tools, and the boys used them constantly. Fighting games were everyday activities encouraged by fathers, uncles, and older brothers who understood that these games were teaching survival skills. The games started simple. Two boys with wooden swords trying to tag each other. Basic stunts, basic strikes, basic blocks. No formal instruction at first, just mimicry and experimentation. But as the boys grew older, the training became more structured and considerably more painful. By age 8 or 9, boys would graduate to heavier wooden weapons and small shields. The games became more intense, more competitive. Brothers fought brothers, cousins fought cousins, neighbor kids battled in fields and forests. Adults would watch, sometimes intervening with advice. Keep your shield higher, watch his shoulder, not his eyes, move your feet, don't stand still like a tree stump. These weren't gentle corrections. Viking culture was direct and often harsh. A boy who made the same mistake repeatedly might get smacked by an adult's wooden sword to emphasize the point. In real battle, that mistake kills you. Remember the pain. Remember the lesson. Wrestling was another crucial component of warrior training. Norse wrestling, called glima, taught boys how to grapple, throw opponents, maintain balance, and fight when weapons were lost or broken. Matches could be brutal. Broken bones weren't uncommon, and a boy who complained too much about injuries would be mocked mercilessly. Physical conditioning happened naturally through the demands of Viking life. Farm work built strength. Hauling water, chopping wood, carrying heavy loads. Rowing ships built endurance and upper body power. Swimming in cold northern waters built toughness and breath control. There was no gym and no structured workout program. Life itself was the conditioning program. By early teenage years, maybe 13 or 14, training became even more serious. Boys would start using real weapons, though usually older, worn-out ones, unsuitable for actual combat. A dulled sword or a notched axe that would never see battle again became a training tool. The weight was real now. The balance was real. The danger was real. Shields were particularly important in Viking combat, and learning to use one properly took years. A shield wasn't just a passive defense. It was an active weapon. You could bash with the edge, hook with the rim, push opponents off balance, create openings for your sword or axe. Boys learned the shield wall formation early, standing shoulder to shoulder with others, shields overlapping, moving as a unit. This training was never really complete. Even experienced warriors practiced constantly. In winter, when raiding and farming were impossible, men would gather in halls and train. They'd wrestle, fight with blunted weapons, teach younger men, learn from each other. The community's survival often depended on its warriors' skills, so training was taken seriously by everyone. Storytelling reinforced combat values. Sagas, told around fires, weren't just entertainment, they were instruction. Heroes who stood their ground were praised. Those who fled were mocked across generations. Young boys absorbed these lessons. Courage matters. Reputation matters. How you die matters as much as how you live. Pain tolerance was explicitly cultivated. A boy who cried from a minor wound would be shamed, not cruelly, for its own sake, but because in battle men fought through injuries, far worse. Learning to function despite pain, to ignore bleeding cuts and bruises, to keep fighting when exhausted, these were survival skills. There was also psychological preparation. Boys were taught that death in battle was honorable, possibly even desirable if you died well. Valhalla, the warrior's paradise, awaited those who fell with weapons in hand. This belief reduced fear of death, which made warriors more dangerous. A man who fears death hesitates. A man who welcomes glorious death charges forward. By 16 or 17, a young man might be considered ready for his first real combat, a minor raid, perhaps, or defending the community from attackers. He'd have spent over a decade preparing for this moment, but no amount of training with wooden swords could fully prepare someone for the reality of actual combat, where real blades cut flesh, where men screamed, where friends died beside you. The first battle was a crucible. Some young men froze, unable to function under the stress and horror. These men usually didn't survive their first fight. Others discovered they had the temperament for combat, the ability to act despite fear, to process the chaos, to kill when necessary. These men became warriors, and once blooded in combat, the real learning began. Because surviving one battle taught lessons no training could. What it feels like when a blade bites into a shield you're holding, how heavy a sword becomes after swinging it for minutes straight, how slippery blood makes everything, how differently men react to injury, how sounds and sights burn into memory forever. The training never stopped. Veterans taught newcomers. Mistakes were analyzed and corrected. New techniques were shared. Weapons skills were constantly refined because in a culture where warfare was common and battles were personal, skill was the difference between surviving to old age or dying young in a field far from home. Weapons, tools of death. Let's talk about the actual weapons Vikings used, because popular culture gets this wrong constantly. Horned helmets didn't exist. Massive two-handed axes were rare and impractical for most combat. The reality was more pragmatic, more brutal, and in many ways more interesting than the myths. The sword was the prestige weapon, but not because it was the most effective, because it was expensive. A good sword represented enormous wealth. The iron alone was valuable, and the craftsmanship required to forge a blade that was sharp, flexible enough not to shatter, and hard enough to hold an edge was extraordinary. A quality sword might cost as much as several horses or a small farm. Only wealthy men, jarls, successful raiders, prosperous landowners could afford swords, and these weapons became family treasures passed down through generations, given names, featured in sagas. A sword wasn't just a tool, it was a status symbol and an heirloom. Losing your ancestral sword in battle was a profound dishonor, a failure felt across your entire family. Viking swords were typically around 30 to 36 inches in blade length, double-edged, with a simple crossguard and a pommel that helped balance the weapon. They were designed for cutting and slashing rather than thrusting. The point was often somewhat rounded rather than sharply tapered. The best swords were pattern welded, a complex forging technique where multiple iron and steel rods were twisted together, forge welded, and then folded repeatedly. This created a blade with a distinctive wavy pattern on the surface and, more importantly, a structure that combined the hardness of steel for holding an edge with the flexibility of softer iron for absorbing impact without shattering. But most Vikings couldn't afford swords. They fought with axes, spears, and knives, weapons that were both practical tools and effective for combat. The axe was the iconic Viking weapon. For good reason. It was everywhere. Every household had axes for chopping wood, clearing land, building. When raiders needed weapons, they grabbed their work axes and went to battle. These weren't specialized weapons for most men. They were tools that happened to be deadly. Viking axes varied widely. The smaller hand axes, or bearded axes with a distinctive extended lower blade edge, were versatile, useful for work and war. Larger battle axes with longer handles provided more reach and power, but were slower to swing. The massive two-handed axes existed, but were specialist weapons used by particularly strong men in specific tactical situations, not standard equipment. An axe had advantages over a sword. It was cheaper. Any blacksmith could forge a decent axe head. It could chop through shields more easily than a sword, and the weight of the head, combined with leverage from the handle, could deliver devastating blows. A solid axe strike could split a skull through a helmet or shatter bones through armor. The disadvantage was that axes were slower, less balanced, and harder to use defensively. A swordsman could block and riposte quickly. An axeman was more committed to each swing, more vulnerable between strikes. This made axes somewhat riskier in one-on-one combat, but perfectly effective in the chaos of group fighting. The spear was probably the most common Viking weapon, even more than axes. Spears were cheap, a wooden shaft and a simple iron point. They were effective at range, could be thrown or thrust, required less training than swords, and were long enough to keep enemies at distance. In formation fighting, spears were arguably more valuable than swords. Viking spears came in many varieties. Light throwing spears, called javelins in modern terms, were used to harass enemies before close combat. Heavier thrusting spears with longer, stouter shafts were used in the shield wall, stabbing at opponents while staying behind your shield. Some spear points had wings or lugs near the base to prevent overpenetration and to help push enemy shields aside. The legendary Gungnir, Odin's spear in Norse mythology, reflected the weapon's importance. This wasn't just a peasant's tool. Even gods wielded spears. Knives were universal. Every man carried a knife for daily tasks, eating, crafting, countless other uses. In combat, the knife was a backup weapon, used when primary weapons were lost or broken, or for the grim work of finishing wounded enemies. A sharp knife could slip between armor plates or stab through gaps in an enemy's guard where a larger weapon wouldn't fit. The seax, a large, single-edged knife or short sword, was particularly common. Blade lengths ranged from 8 to 30 inches in close quarters, especially in the brutal wrestling matches that sometimes developed during battle. A seax could be drawn and used to deadly effect. Bows and arrows were used, though less prominently than in some other military traditions. Viking warriors generally didn't specialize as archers. Archery was more a hunting skill that could be applied in warfare. Arrows were used to harass enemies before close combat, to target specific high-value opponents, or to rain down on enemies from defensive positions. Most battlefield archery was relatively short range, maybe 50, 100 yards, shooting in high arcs so arrows fell on enemy formations from above. Accuracy wasn't the goal. Volume was. If 50 men shot arrows at an enemy shield wall, even if most missed or were blocked, some would find gaps and wound or kill fighters. Slings were occasionally used, particularly by younger or less wealthy fighters. A leather sling and some stones cost almost nothing but could crack skulls or break bones at surprising distances. Sling bullets, shaped stones, or lead weights could be devastating, but slings required considerable practice to use effectively, and their use seems to have been limited compared to other ranged weapons. Vikings occasionally used bows and arrows while on ships, shooting at enemies on shore or on other vessels before boarding actions. But again, archery wasn't central to Viking tactical doctrine the way it was for, say, English longbowmen or Mongol horse archers centuries later. Now let's talk about armor and protection. Because Hollywood, Vikings are usually either completely unarmored or wearing elaborate plate armor, and both extremes are wrong. Most Viking warriors had minimal armor simply because metal armor was expensive and difficult to make. The average raider or farmer warrior wore his regular clothes, wool tunic, trousers, cloak, with maybe a leather jerkin for minimal protection against cuts. This wasn't effective armor against a determined attack, but it was better than nothing. The shield was the primary defense for virtually all Viking warriors. These were round, typically 30 to 36 inches in diameter, made from wooden planks, usually pine or linden wood, covered with leather. The center had an iron boss, a dome-shaped piece protecting the hand grip behind it. Viking shields were relatively thin and light, maybe half an inch thick. They weren't meant to withstand dozens of heavy blows. They'd split and break apart after absorbing significant punishment. But they were light enough to maneuver quickly, cheap enough to replace, and effective enough to save your life in the crucial moments of combat. Wealthier warriors might have mail armor, what's often incorrectly called chainmail. This was iron rings, each individually riveted or welded, woven together into a shirt that covered the torso and upper arms. A full mail shirt might contain 20,000 to 30,000 rings, representing hundreds of hours of labor. It was phenomenally expensive. Mail was effective protection against slashing cuts and many stabbing attacks, distributing force across a wide area. But it didn't stop powerful blows from axes or hammers, which could break bones beneath the mail without penetrating. And mail was heavy, 30 to 40 pounds or more, which was exhausting to wear during extended combat. Helmets were far more common than body armor because they were more affordable and crucially important. Head injuries were often fatal. Viking helmets were simple, usually a dome of iron, possibly with a nose guard, extending down to protect the face. The iconic image of the Spangenhelm, a helmet constructed from several pieces riveted together, was common. Forget the horned helmets. They didn't exist in Viking Age Scandinavia for warfare. Horns would catch weapons, make the helmet easier to knock off, and serve no practical purpose. Some ceremonial helmets might have had decorative elements, but actual combat helmets were pragmatic and streamlined. Wealthy warriors sometimes had lamellar armor, small iron or hardened leather plates laced together, or reinforced leather armor, but these were rare luxury items. The vast majority of Viking warriors went into battle with a shield, a weapon, and not much else between their skin and enemy blades. This lack of armor shaped Viking tactics and psychology. Battles were quick, violent affairs. Men couldn't sustain prolonged fighting when every blow might be lethal. Combat required aggression, shock, and momentum. If you hesitated or faltered, you died. This created a particular mentality: fierce, committed, willing to take risks because defense alone wasn't enough. The shield wall, violence in formation. The shield wall was the foundation of Viking battle tactics, a formation that transformed individual warriors into something greater and more deadly than the sum of their parts. Understanding how it worked reveals a lot about the reality of Viking warfare versus the berserker myths. The basic concept was simple. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder in a line, shields overlapping, creating a continuous wall of wood and iron. The front rank held their shields up, covering from chin to knee. Spears or swords projected forward from gaps between shields. The line moved and fought as a unit, simple in concept but requiring discipline, trust, and practice to execute under the stress of combat. A shield wall was only as strong as its weakest point. If one man broke or fled, the gap would compromise the entire formation. Here's how it worked in practice. Imagine you're a warrior in the front rank. Your shield is on your left arm, overlapping with the shield of the man to your left. His shield covers part of your left side. Your shield covers part of his right side. The man to your right is doing the same on the other side. You're holding a spear or sword in your right hand, which is your shield side neighbor's unprotected side, but his shield is covering you there. This overlapping coverage means you're partially responsible for defending the man to your left and partially dependent on the man to your right. You can't just worry about yourself. Your survival is bound to your comrades. The formation stands steady as the enemy approaches. Maybe they're also in a shield wall. Maybe they're a looser formation. Either way, the moment before contact is psychologically crushing. You can see death coming at you, hear men shouting and screaming, smell the fear and aggression, and there's nowhere to go. You can't retreat. Without breaking the formation and dooming your comrades, you can only stand and wait. Then contact. The shield walls crash together with tremendous force, wood slamming against wood, men pushing and shoving, trying to create openings. This isn't the fluid, dancing combat of movies. It's brutal, grinding, exhausting pressure. You push with your shield, trying to drive the enemy back or knock them off balance. Your comrades are doing the same. The enemy is pushing back just as hard. Men in the second rank brace their shields against the backs of the front rank, adding their weight and strength to the push. While pushing, you're also trying to strike. You thrust your spear over your shield, aiming for faces, throats, any exposed flesh, or you bring your sword down on enemy shields and helmets, trying to injure, kill, or at least exhaust them. The enemy is doing the same to you. Spear points, probe constantly, looking for gaps, axes, chop at shields, trying to splinter them or hook them out of position. Swords slash at arms, heads, any target that appears. It's deafeningly loud, shields cracking, metal clanging, men grunting with effort, wounded men screaming. It smells like sweat, blood, shit, because fear and abdominal wounds both cause that, and unwashed bodies pressed together. Your shield is taking punishment. You feel every impact transmitted through the wood and straps into your arm. Each blow rattles your bones, jars your shoulder, exhausts your muscles. A heavy axe blow might split your shield partially, requiring you to hold it differently to keep it functional. Men in the front ranks tire quickly. Maybe a few minutes of intense pushing and fighting before they're gasping for breath, arms burning with fatigue, barely able to hold their shields up. This is when fresher warriors from behind would cycle forward, taking their place, while exhausted front rankers fell back to recover. This rotation required discipline and coordination. You couldn't just randomly swap positions. That would create gaps and confusion. The whole rear rank might step forward together, and the front rank would step back through gaps, or the exchange might happen in sections, a few men at a time. The shield wall could win in several ways. Sometimes one side would slowly push the other back through sheer pressure, forcing them up hills or into terrain obstacles where they'd become disorganized and vulnerable. Sometimes concentrated attacks would create a gap in the enemy line, kill or seriously wound several men in one spot, and warriors would pour through, attacking the enemy from the side where shields didn't protect them. Sometimes morale would break. The psychological pressure of standing in the front rank, absorbing punishment, seeing friends die beside you, knowing you might be next. It was overwhelming. If enough men in one section started pulling back or fleeing, The panic could spread. Once one section of a shield wall collapsed, the entire formation could unravel in seconds, turning into a rout. The worst thing that could happen to a shield wall was being flanked, having enemies attack from the side or behind. The formation only protected in the direction it faced. Men facing forward couldn't defend against attacks from other angles. This is why terrain was so important, why armies fought with rivers, forests, or marshes, protecting their flanks when possible. Shield walls also had weaknesses against certain tactics. Cavalry charges, while rare in Viking warfare due to terrain and lack of heavy cavalry tradition, could shatter shield walls through shock and momentum. Concentrated archery from longer ranges could wound shield wall fighters before contact, though shields provided good protection if men could raise them overhead. The shield wall wasn't used in all situations. It required relatively flat, open ground. In forests, on rocky terrain, on ships, or in village streets, the formation couldn't be maintained. Here, combat fragmented into individual or small group fights where personal skill mattered more than formation discipline. But when terrain and numbers allowed, the shield wall was the default Viking battle tactic. It maximized the effectiveness of less skilled warriors, provided mutual protection, and created psychological security. You weren't facing the enemy alone. You were part of something larger. Training for shield wall combat started young. Boys would practice forming lines, coordinating movement, maintaining shield overlap. They'd practice the pushing and shoving, learn to brace properly, experience what it felt like to have weight and pressure coming from in front and behind. Veterans would correct mistakes. Too much gap between shields. Push your shield tighter to your neighbor. Don't swing wildly. Short controlled strikes. Save your strength. Battles last longer than you think. Don't watch the enemy's weapon. Watch his center of mass. If he moves, his weapon follows. The shield wall also had a social function. Standing in that line with your neighbors, relatives, and friends created bonds. You'd literally trusted them with your life, and they'd trusted you with theirs. Men who broke under pressure and fled were exiled from communities, not just for cowardice, but for betraying that trust. Conversely, men who stood firm, who fought bravely, who saved comrades' lives, these men gained reputation, honor, and social standing. In a culture where reputation was everything, where your deeds would be sung in poems and remembered for generations, the shield wall was where reputations were made or destroyed. Berserkers and Ulfhednar, myth and reality. Now let's address one of the most misunderstood aspects of Viking warfare, the berserkers. Popular culture depicts them as wild, uncontrollable madmen who charged into battle naked, foaming at the mouth, impervious to pain, fighting with supernatural strength. There's some truth buried in this, but the reality is more complex and more interesting. The word berserk likely comes from Old Norse berserker, which might mean bear shirt or possibly bear shirt. There's scholarly debate about this. Ulfhednar, wolf coats, were similar but associated with wolves rather than bears. Both were warriors who entered a trance-like battle fury. Did these warriors actually exist? Yes, they're mentioned in numerous saga sources and historical texts. Adam of Bremen, a medieval chronicler, described Norse warriors who fought without armor, savage as wolves. The Ynglinga saga describes Odin's men. They went without mailcoats and were frenzied as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields and were as strong as bears or boars. They slew men, but neither fire nor iron could hurt them. But we need to separate propaganda, myth, and exaggeration from what probably actually happened. Here's what we can reasonably infer. Berserkers were likely warriors who worked themselves into an altered psychological state before combat, possibly through combinations of ritual, psychological preparation, and perhaps drugs or alcohol. The berserk rage was probably a dissociative state where pain was diminished, fear was suppressed, and aggressive behavior was amplified. This isn't supernatural, it's psychology. Combat stress, adrenaline, and certain mental techniques can produce profound alterations in consciousness. Modern soldiers sometimes report similar experiences, feeling no pain from wounds during firefights, performing feats of strength that would be impossible in normal states, having no memory of parts of the battle afterward. Some historians speculate that berserkers might have used various substances to achieve these states. Fly agaric mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, which grow throughout Scandinavia and have psychoactive properties, are one candidate. Henbane, another plant with psychoactive compounds, is another possibility. Strong alcohol could also play a role. But here's what's important. Berserkers weren't uncontrollable lunatics. They couldn't have been, because uncontrollable lunatics are useless in warfare. You can't have warriors attacking their own side, ignoring orders, breaking formation, or being unable to function strategically. Berserkers were likely elite warriors who cultivated this battle trance as a specialization, used it tactically, and maintained enough control to be useful. They probably fought as shock troops, sent at crucial moments to break enemy lines through sheer ferocity and apparent invulnerability to pain. Imagine you're in a shield wall, fighting steadily, when suddenly several warriors who seem to feel no pain, who are screaming and attacking with terrifying intensity, who ignore wounds that would drop normal men, these warriors crash into your line. The psychological effect would be enormous. Fear is contagious in combat. If these mad warriors break through and start killing men in your formation, panic could spread quickly. The impervious to pain aspect probably wasn't literal immunity. It was likely that berserkers, in their altered state, could ignore pain temporarily and fight through wounds that would incapacitate others. Adrenaline and dissociation can allow this in normal people. Cultivated and amplified, it might produce impressive results, but berserkers could still be killed. They weren't invulnerable. Arrows, spears, and swords worked just fine on them. They'd bleed out from serious wounds, just like anyone else. The neither fire nor iron could hurt them was obvious exaggeration, probably based on their tendency to keep fighting despite injuries. The fighting naked or without armor aspect might have some truth. If berserkers were cultivating a trance state and wanted to intimidate enemies, going into battle without armor would certainly be terrifying to watch. It would also demonstrate confidence. I don't need protection because I'm too dangerous to stop. But more likely, many berserkers simply couldn't afford good armor. If you're a young warrior trying to build reputation through spectacular feats, you might not have the wealth for mail yet. Fighting without armor, surviving through speed and aggression, could be a necessity, turned into a tactical choice. The biting of shields mentioned in sources is interesting. This might have been a pre-battle ritual to work themselves up, creating a mental state for the coming fight. Or it might have been intimidation, making enemy warriors afraid before the battle even started. Look at these madmen biting their shields. What chance do we have? There's also debate about whether berserker was a permanent status or a temporary state. Were there professional berserkers who fought this way all the time, or were these ordinary warriors who could enter berserker state when needed? Evidence suggests probably the latter. Berserkers were called on in specific situations, but otherwise might function as normal warriors. In later Viking Age society, berserkers seem to have acquired a negative reputation. Some laws and saga accounts mention berserkers causing problems in peacetime, challenging people to duels over trivial matters, bullying communities, being violent when not in warfare contexts. This suggests that whatever psychological techniques created the berserker state might have had lasting effects, making some practitioners unstable or antisocial. By the end of the Viking Age, as Scandinavia became more Christian and centralized under royal authority, berserkers were increasingly outlawed and suppressed. Christian authorities viewed them as pagan and demonic. Centralized monarchies didn't want independent warriors who operated outside normal military discipline. The Ulfhednar wolfcoats seem to have been similar but distinct, possibly having different rituals or spiritual connections. The association with wolves versus bears might have reflected different warrior cults or traditions within Norse society, but sources about them are even scarcer than for berserkers. Modern attempts to understand berserkers have included everything from psychiatric explanations, they were psychotic or had specific mental disorders, to pharmacological theories, they used drugs, to purely psychological explanations, intense ritual and mental preparation. The truth probably varied. Different individuals might have used different methods to achieve similar results. What we can say with confidence, berserkers were real warriors who existed in Viking Age Scandinavia, who cultivated a fearsome reputation through psychological techniques and spectacular displays of courage and pain tolerance, who were used tactically in warfare but weren't the primary fighting force, and who left a cultural legacy far larger than their actual numbers or military significance would suggest. They're fascinating because they represent an extreme of Viking warrior culture, the intersection of warfare, spirituality, psychology, and reputation. But they weren't typical, and they weren't the main reason Vikings were successful in warfare. That came from more mundane factors: good ships, surprise tactics, shield wall discipline, and warriors who trained from childhood. Raids, the reality of Viking attacks. When most people think of Viking warfare, they think of raids. Longships appearing suddenly on coastlines, warriors pouring ashore, violence and plunder, then vanishing before defenders could respond. This wasn't just random savagery, it was a sophisticated military strategy that evolved over generations and shaped medieval Europe. The classic Viking raid followed a pattern. It started with intelligence gathering. Not every raid was random. Vikings talked to traders, captured prisoners who could describe local geography and defenses, and observed coastlines during trading visits. When they returned to raid, they often knew exactly where they were going. Timing mattered. enormously. Raids typically happened during the summer months when weather was favorable for sea travel and daylight was long. The raiding season roughly corresponded with when farming work was lighter after spring planting but before harvest. This allowed farmers to become raiders without abandoning their crops. Targets were carefully chosen. Monasteries and churches were favorites for several reasons. They held valuable silver and gold church items. They were usually near coasts or rivers for easy access. They were poorly defended since monks weren't warriors, and frankly, early Vikings didn't share Christian taboos about attacking religious sites. Coastal villages and small towns were other prime targets, wealthy enough to have goods worth taking, but not so large or well defended that the raiders would take heavy casualties. Vikings avoided attacking fortified cities or large military forces when possible. The goal was profitable, low-risk raids, not glorious battles. The approach was crucial. Longships could navigate in very shallow water, often just 3 feet deep. This allowed Vikings to sail up rivers far inland, appearing in places that seemed safely distant from the sea. Villages that felt protected by miles of river between them and the coast would wake up to find dragon-proud ships beached on their riverbanks. Vikings typically attacked at dawn. They'd approach during the night, beach their ships quietly, and then launch the assault as the sun rose. Defenders would be asleep or just waking, disorganized, unable to mount effective resistance. By the time locals gathered weapons and formed any defense, Vikings had already grabbed valuables and were prepared to fight or flee as circumstances required. The assault itself was brutal and quick. Warriors would rush into the target with shields and weapons, killing anyone who resisted, grabbing anything portable and valuable: church silver, coins, jewelry, fine cloth, food supplies, and tools. All were worth taking. Iron tools and weapons were particularly valuable since metal was expensive. People were also taken. Captives could be enslaved and sold, ransomed if wealthy, or kept as thralls. Slaves in Scandinavia, young, healthy people, were preferred since they'd bring better prices or be more useful as slaves. This aspect of Viking raids is often glossed over in popular culture, but slavery was a significant part of the Viking economy. Resistance was typically met with overwhelming violence. Vikings needed to maintain their reputation for ferocity. If attacking a village was known to be costly and dangerous, more villagers would resist. But if villagers knew that resistance meant everyone would be killed, many would simply surrender and hope for mercy. Some monasteries paid tribute, protection money, to avoid being raided. The more Vikings could get through intimidation without actually fighting, the better. Fighting meant risk of injury or death, and even a relatively minor wound could become infected and kill you in an age without antibiotics. The raid lasted as long as was safe, typically just a few hours. The goal was to grab everything valuable and leave before significant military forces could arrive. Lingering was dangerous. Local lords, thanes, or nobles would eventually gather armed men and respond. Vikings wanted to be back on their ships and rowing away before this happened. If defenders did organize and counterattack before the raid was complete, Vikings could either fight them if the defenders were few and poorly organized, or retreat to their ships. The ships were both transportation and escape route, usually guarded by some warriors, while others raided inland. If things went bad, the ship provided safety. Not all raids were successful. Sometimes defenders were ready, having warning of the attack. Sometimes Vikings encountered more resistance than expected and had to flee with fewer spoils or even take casualties. Ships could be damaged or destroyed by storms on the return voyage, sending plunder and men to the bottom of the sea. But enough raids were successful that the strategy worked for generations. The economic incentive was powerful. A successful raid could bring back more wealth than a year of farming. For younger sons with no inheritance, raiding offered a path to riches and glory. For established chieftains, raids brought wealth that could be distributed to followers, building their power and reputation. Over time, raids evolved. What started as hit-and-run attacks on undefended monasteries became more ambitious. By the mid-800s, Vikings were launching large-scale invasions with hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors. They'd establish fortified camps and spend entire seasons raiding a region systematically. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 was no longer raiding. It was conquering, seizing territory, displacing local rulers and settling. This represented an evolution from opportunistic piracy to organized military campaign and colonization. Defenders evolved too. Fortifications improved. Early warning systems were established, beacons that could be lit to alert neighboring settlements of attacks. Local militias were organized and trained. Larger military forces could be mobilized more quickly. By the late 9th and 10th centuries, Viking raids became riskier and less profitable as defenses improved. The shift from raiding to trading and settling reflected this changing reality. As Christian kingdoms became better organized and defended, Vikings found more profit in trade than plunder. Scandinavian kingdoms themselves became Christianized and centralized, making it harder to launch independent raids without royal authority. But for nearly 3 centuries, the Viking raid was one of the most effective military strategies in medieval Europe. It exploited superior naval mobility, used surprise and speed to offset defensive advantages, and created economic incentives that sustained itself across generations. The terror it generated was out of proportion to actual deaths or destruction, which was strategically useful. Reputation was a weapon, all its own. Naval combat, fighting on the water. Viking warfare wasn't only about land battles and coastal raids. Significant combat occurred at sea, ship-to-ship fighting that combined naval maneuvering, archery, and brutal hand-to-hand combat on unstable platforms. And these engagements had their own tactics and challenges. Naval battles typically started with a pursuit or meeting engagement. Ships would spot each other at sea and either pursue if they thought they could win or flee if outmatched. Speed and maneuverability mattered here. A well-crewed, well-maintained ship could outrun or outmaneuver a slower, more heavily loaded vessel. Once combat was inevitable, the approach phase began. Ships would row toward each other, building up speed for the collision. Unlike later naval warfare with cannons and broadside tactics, Viking naval combat was essentially land warfare adapted to floating platforms. As ships closed, archers would begin shooting. The goal wasn't precision, it was volume. Dozens of arrows would arc through the air, falling on the enemy ship, forcing crews to raise shields and take cover. Some arrows would wound or kill, but more importantly, they'd disrupt the enemy's coordination and morale. Spears and javelins followed at closer range. Warriors would hurl throwing spears at the enemy ship, targeting anyone who looked important or exposed. The helmsman was a priority target. Kill or wound him, and the enemy ship would lose control. The captain or chieftain was another priority. Kill the leader, and the crew's cohesion might collapse. Then came the collision. The goal wasn't to ram and sink the enemy. Viking ships were too light and fragile for that. The goal was to get close enough for boarding. Ships would be rowed alongside each other, and warriors would use grappling hooks to pull them together, lashing them side by side. Now the real fighting began. Warriors would try to board the enemy vessel, climbing over shields and railings, fighting to establish a foothold on the enemy deck. The defenders would try to repel them, pushing with shields, stabbing with spears, creating a brutal melee in the confined space. This was fighting at its most desperate and chaotic. Ships rolled and pitched with the waves. Footing was treacherous. Decks were wet, sometimes bloody, cluttered with ropes and cargo. Men fought in close quarters, where sword skill mattered less than strength, aggression, and the ability to keep your balance while someone tried to kill you. The advantage went to whichever side could get more men onto the contested deck space. Numbers mattered enormously. If you could overwhelm one section of the enemy ship, killing or driving back defenders, you could pour more warriors across, and the battle would cascade into victory. But boarding was dangerous and exhausting. Fighting on a moving, unstable platform while wearing armor, if you had any, and trying not to fall overboard, required immense physical effort. Men tired quickly, and the side with fresher reserves could often turn the tide even after losing the initial clashes. Some battles involved multiple ships on each side. These became incredibly complex, with ships lashed together in lines or clusters, warriors fighting across several vessels simultaneously, the whole mass drifting with wind and current. These engagements could last hours, with warriors rotating to rest, fighting resuming when everyone caught their breath. Victory came when the enemy crew was killed, forced overboard, or surrendered. The victors would take the enemy ship as a prize, along with any cargo, weapons, and survivors who could be enslaved or ransomed. The ship itself was valuable. A well-built longship represented enormous labor and resources. Fleeing a naval battle was possible, but risky. You had to disengage, which meant cutting grappling lines while under attack, then rowing away faster than the enemy could pursue. If you had the faster ship and fresher crew, you might escape. If not, the enemy would run you down, and the fighting would resume with your crew even more exhausted. Some naval tactics were more sophisticated. Larger fleets might try to surround smaller enemy forces, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. Ships might feint attacks to draw enemy ships out of formation, then strike at the exposed vessels. Commanders would position their strongest ships and best warriors at crucial points in their formation. The flagship, usually the largest and best equipped vessel, commanded by a jarl or king, would be the center of the fleet. Protecting it was crucial. Lose the flagship, and the whole fleet's morale could collapse. Attacking and capturing the enemy flagship was the highest prize, bringing glory and often ending the battle as the enemy fleet scattered. Weather played a huge role. Wind direction determined who had the advantage in maneuvering. Rough seas made fighting nearly impossible. Men would be just trying to stay aboard and keep ships from swamping. Smart commanders would try to force battle in conditions favorable to them and avoid it when disadvantaged. Storms were more dangerous than any enemy. A ship could be lost in minutes if caught in severe weather with no warning. Crews might have to cut down their masts to prevent capsizing, throw cargo overboard to lighten the ship, bail frantically to stay afloat. Entire fleets could be scattered or destroyed by storms, as happened to both Viking and English fleets multiple times in recorded history. Fog was both opportunity and danger. You could use it to escape or approach unseen, but you could also become separated from your fleet and vulnerable. Viking navigators dreaded fog in enemy waters. You might run aground on unseen rocks or be ambushed by enemies who knew the local geography better. Naval combat required different skills than land warfare. Balance and sea legs were crucial. You couldn't fight effectively if you were prone to seasickness or couldn't keep your feet on a rolling deck. Swimming ability mattered too, though most men who went overboard in armor or after serious wounds wouldn't survive anyway. Ships also required different tactics. You couldn't form a shield wall on a ship's deck the same way you could on land. Space was too cramped, the platform too unstable. Fighting was more individual or in small groups, requiring personal combat skill rather than formation discipline. But the key core elements remained courage, aggression, skill with weapons, and willingness to kill or be killed. Whether on land or water, Viking combat was brutal, personal, and unforgiving. The sea just added another layer of danger and complexity to an already deadly business. Siege warfare, breaking defenses. Vikings are famous for raids and sea battles, but they also engaged in siege warfare, though this wasn't their strength initially. Early Viking raiders avoided fortified positions. Why attack walls when undefended monasteries were available? But as expansion turned to conquest, Vikings had to develop siege capabilities. The challenge was that Vikings came from a culture without stone fortifications. Scandinavia had relatively few stone castles or walled cities. Most settlements were unfortified or protected by wooden palisades at best. Vikings had limited experience building or breaking sophisticated defenses, but they learned, adapting and borrowing techniques from the cultures they fought. By the time Vikings were establishing kingdoms in England, Ireland, and France, they'd become competent, if not exceptional, at siege warfare. The simplest siege tactic was blockade. Surround a fortification, cut off supplies, and wait for the defenders to starve or surrender. This required patience and sufficient forces to maintain the encirclement. But it worked eventually. Time was usually on the attacker's side. Defenders had limited food and water, while attackers could forage from the surrounding countryside. However, blockades took time, sometimes months or years, for well-supplied fortifications. Vikings often didn't have that patience or couldn't maintain large forces in one place for extended periods. They needed quicker methods. Direct assault was faster, but far more costly in lives. Attacking walls meant approaching under arrow fire, climbing ladders while defenders threw down stones and spears, fighting at the top where defenders had every advantage. Many assaults failed with heavy casualties for the attackers. Vikings used scaling ladders extensively. Simple wooden ladders carried to the walls and raised under fire. The first men up were often killed, but if enough ladders were used simultaneously at different points, defenders couldn't stop them all. Eventually, some attackers would gain the top of the wall and hold it long enough for more warriors to climb up and overwhelm that section. Siege towers were occasionally built, tall wooden structures on wheels that could be rolled up to walls, allowing attackers to fight defenders at the same level rather than climbing exposed ladders. But these required significant time and resources to construct, and Vikings often lacked the engineering expertise and materials. Battering rams were simpler and more commonly used, a large wooden beam, sometimes with an iron tip, would be carried by multiple men and smashed repeatedly against gates or walls. A roof of shields protected the ram carriers from arrows and dropped stones. Given time, rams could break through wooden gates or damage stone walls, especially if they targeted weak points. Mining was another technique borrowed from other cultures. Attackers would dig tunnels under walls, supporting the tunnel with wooden props. Once the tunnel reached under the wall, they'd fill it with combustible materials and set it on fire. The props would burn away, the tunnel would collapse, and ideally, the wall above would crack and fall. This required substantial labor and was only possible in certain soil conditions, but it was effective when conditions allowed. Fire was used when possible. Many early medieval fortifications included wooden elements, gates, fighting platforms, roof structures. Flaming arrows or hurled firebrands could ignite these, creating chaos inside the fortification and potentially forcing gates to open. Viking raids sometimes specifically targeted gates with fire to breach them quickly. Psychological warfare played a role. Vikings would parade captured prisoners and execute them in sight of the defenders, hoping to break morale. They'd display wealth and supplies, suggesting the siege could last indefinitely. They'd make night attacks to prevent defenders from resting, wearing them down through exhaustion. Treachery and negotiation were often more effective than force. Vikings would offer generous terms to garrisons that surrendered quickly. Safe passage, keeping their possessions, even keeping some of the fortification's wealth. Fighting to the bitter end, by contrast, meant no mercy. Everyone killed or enslaved. This created incentive to negotiate rather than resist. Bribes worked too, offering gold to a key defender, the gate guard, a commander, anyone with access could open fortifications without fighting. This was perfectly acceptable in Viking thinking. Why lose warriors assaulting walls when you could pay someone to open the gate? Vikings also learned that some fortifications weren't worth taking directly. Bypassing a castle and raiding the surrounding countryside could be more profitable and less costly. Fortifications protected the people inside them, but if everyone outside was killed or enslaved and all the countryside plundered, the fortification became irrelevant, a prison as much as a protection. The great armies' campaigns in England showed Vikings developing siege capabilities. They captured major fortified towns like York, fortified existing cities as bases, and withstood sieges themselves. They weren't as sophisticated as Byzantine or Islamic siege engineers, but they were competent enough to succeed. By the late Viking Age, Norse kingdoms in England and Normandy were building their own fortifications and developing indigenous siege expertise. The descendants of Vikings who'd once avoided walls were now building castles and conducting sophisticated military campaigns that required siege warfare. But siegecraft was never Vikings' preferred mode of war. They excelled at mobility, surprise, and shock attacks. Grinding sieges that might last months were antithetical to Viking strengths. When possible, they still preferred to find an enemy in the open, maneuver for advantage, and win through aggressive attack rather than patient siege. Strategy and tactics. The thinking behind the violence. Viking warfare wasn't mindless aggression, despite the reputation. Successful Viking leaders were strategic thinkers who understood logistics, intelligence gathering, coalition building, and grand strategy. The difference between a minor raider and a kingdom-building conqueror was often intelligence and planning rather than just courage. Intelligence gathering was crucial. Before major campaigns, Vikings would gather information about their targets, political situations, military strengths, alliance structures, geography, and economic resources. Traders provided much of this information, traveling widely and observing carefully. Captives could be interrogated. Even sagas and songs might contain useful information about who was feuding with whom or which regions were wealthy. Timing was strategic. Attacks were often launched when enemies were distracted by internal conflicts or fighting other foes. The great heathen army invaded England, partly because English kingdoms were divided and warring among themselves. Striking when enemies couldn't unite against you multiplied your effective strength. Coalition building mattered enormously. Large Viking armies were usually coalitions of multiple jarls and their followers, temporarily united for a campaign. The leader who could attract and hold together the largest coalition had the greatest power. This required sharing plunder fairly, respecting allies' autonomy, and building reputation as a successful war leader who brought victory and wealth. Logistics were a constant challenge. Large armies needed enormous quantities of food, and carrying supplies over long distances was difficult. Vikings relied heavily on foraging and plunder to feed their armies, which meant they had to keep moving to new areas with fresh supplies. This influenced strategy significantly. Campaigns followed paths where food and plunder were available. Ships provided crucial logistical advantages. A fleet could carry much more supplies than a land army could transport, and rivers allowed deep penetration inland while maintaining supply lines. This is why Viking invasions so often followed river systems: the Thames in England, the Seine in France, the Volga and Dnieper in Eastern Europe. Base camps and fortifications became important during extended campaigns. Rather than constantly moving, Vikings would establish fortified camps that served as supply depots and safe havens. These camps could be defended by relatively few warriors, allowing the main army to raid widely while having a secure place to return to. Defensive strategy mattered too. When Vikings established settlements, they had to defend them against counterattacks. This led to building fortifications, establishing garrisons, and creating early warning systems. The Danelaw in England and Norse kingdoms in Ireland became defensive as much as offensive positions. Political strategy often trumped military strategy. Marriage alliances, tribute arrangements, vassal relationships. These political tools extended Viking influence without constant warfare. A local ruler who accepted Norse overlordship and paid tribute was more valuable than a destroyed enemy kingdom that required constant military occupation. Adaptive tactics were a Viking strength. They learned from enemies, adopted effective techniques, and abandoned tactics that didn't work. Early Viking raiders who attacked monasteries evolved into army commanders who conducted sophisticated campaigns. This adaptability gave them advantages over more rigid opponents. Psychological warfare was deliberate. Vikings cultivated reputations for ferocity, partly for strategic reasons. If enemies expected no mercy and fierce resistance, some would surrender without fighting. The terror Vikings generated was strategic advantage as much as byproduct of violence. Economic warfare was practiced, destroying enemy resources, capturing slaves, disrupting trade routes. These actions weakened enemies. Even without direct military confrontation, a kingdom devastated by raids might lack the resources to field armies, making eventual conquest easier. Religious and cultural factors influenced strategy. Pagan Vikings attacking Christian kingdoms could exploit religious sites' vulnerability. Later, Christianized Vikings could use religious legitimacy to justify rule over Christian populations. Religious conversion was sometimes strategic calculation as much as genuine belief. The long-term view separated great leaders from merely successful raiders. Someone like Rollo, who founded Normandy, understood that raiding had limits. Eventually, settled territory and political legitimacy provided more lasting power than piracy. This strategic vision transformed Vikings from raiders to rulers. The psychological reality of combat. We've talked about tactics and weapons and formations, but let's address something harder to quantify but absolutely crucial: the psychological reality of Viking combat. And what was it actually like, mentally and emotionally, to fight this way? First, understand that most combat occurred between men who could see each other's faces. This wasn't long-range rifle fire or artillery bombardment. You could see the man you were trying to kill, hear his breathing, smell his fear and sweat, and he could see you just as clearly. This intimacy made killing psychologically difficult in ways modern people struggle to understand. The natural human reluctance to kill is well documented. Most people, even trained soldiers, have deep inhibitions against taking human life. In historical battles, a significant percentage of soldiers wouldn't fire their weapons even under direct attack. The psychological cost of killing was too high. Vikings overcame this through cultural conditioning that started in childhood. Boys were taught that enemies weren't fully human in the same way your family and community were. Foreign people, especially Christians who worshipped differently, could be killed without the same moral weight as killing a fellow Norseman. The honor culture also helped. Killing enemies brought glory, reputation, and social status. Not fighting, showing cowardice, or failing to protect your community brought shame worse than death. These social pressures pushed men into combat despite natural reluctance. The shield wall formation itself was a psychological tool. Standing alone, facing death, most men would flee. But standing shoulder to shoulder with comrades, you couldn't flee without betraying them and living with that shame forever. The formation physically prevented easy escape and socially bound men together through shared danger. Pre-battle rituals served psychological purposes, weapons checking, arranging armor, forming up in ranks. These familiar rituals created mental preparation. War cries and songs helped synchronize groups and build courage through collective action. You weren't facing death alone. You were part of something larger. The waiting before battle was psychologically crushing. You could see the enemy, knew violence was coming, but didn't know when. Minutes stretched endlessly. Some men would vomit from stress, others would urinate or defecate involuntarily. This was so common, it wasn't considered shameful, just body responding to extreme stress. The moment of contact brought strange psychological relief. The waiting ended. Action began. Many warriors described feeling almost calm once fighting started, the mind narrowing to immediate threats and actions, everything else falling away. This tunnel vision was probably psychological coping mechanism, focus on surviving the next second rather than contemplating mortality. Time distortion was common. Minutes of combat could feel like hours, or hours could pass in what felt like minutes. Memory became unreliable. Warriors might not remember significant portions of battles afterward, their minds protecting them from trauma by not encoding certain memories. The sounds of battle were psychologically overwhelming. Men screaming in pain, rage and fear, metal crashing against metal and wood, the wet sounds of blades cutting flesh. Warriors reported that battle noise was sometimes worse than the visual horror, impossible to shut out or ignore. The smell was distinctive and nauseating. Blood has a sharp, metallic smell. Bowels, voided by fear or abdominal wounds, created another layer of stench. Sweat, vomit, urine, all mixed together in oppressive, unforgettable odor that many veterans said they could never completely forget. Physical exhaustion came quickly. Fighting with hand weapons while wearing armor, if you had it, maintaining shield position, striking and defending, all this burned energy at incredible rates. Within minutes, arms would burn, lungs would gasp, legs would tremble. Continuing to fight while exhausted required willpower. Most modern people can't imagine. Injuries had to be fought through. Minor wounds, cuts, bruises, even broken fingers couldn't stop you. If you dropped your weapon or shield due to injury, you'd likely be killed. Warriors learned to function through pain levels that would incapacitate untrained people. Adrenaline helped, but will and training mattered more. The aftermath was psychologically traumatic in ways Viking culture didn't really have tools to address. Post-traumatic stress wasn't understood or named, but it existed. Warriors would have nightmares, startle at sudden movements, struggle to readjust to peaceful life. Some became permanently changed, more aggressive, or withdrawn. Survivors' guilt affected men who lived while comrades died. Why did you survive when your friend beside you was killed? Some warriors believed they'd been chosen by fate or gods for future purpose. Others felt undeserved shame at surviving when braver men died. Killing another human being left psychological marks. The first kill was particularly difficult for many warriors, crossing that boundary between theoretical warrior and actual killer. Some men found they couldn't do it, froze at the crucial moment, and often died for their hesitation. Others found they could kill, but felt profound distress afterward. A few warriors discovered they were good at killing and didn't feel remorse. These men often became famous or infamous. Saga descriptions of warriors who loved battle and smiled when fighting probably described individuals who either suppressed normal empathy or lacked it entirely. These were valuable but dangerous men. Cultural framework helped warriors process trauma, understanding combat as part of fate, believing that brave deaths led to Valhalla, viewing warfare as honorable and necessary. These beliefs provided meaning that made the horror more bearable. Modern soldiers often struggle precisely because contemporary culture doesn't provide equivalent meaning-making frameworks. Alcohol played a significant role in psychological coping. Mead and ale helped warriors relax after combat, suppressed traumatic memories, and facilitated social bonding through shared drinking. The Viking culture of feasting and heavy drinking after raids or battles served important psychological function, though they wouldn't have understood it in modern therapeutic terms. Dark humor was another coping mechanism. Warriors would make jokes about battles, death, injuries, humor that would seem shocking or inappropriate to outsiders, but helped those who lived through combat process the experience. Laughing at horror made it slightly less overwhelming. The psychological cost of Viking warfare was real and significant. Even if contemporary Vikings didn't understand it in modern terms, many warriors probably carried trauma throughout their lives. Some became more violent and unstable. Others withdrew from combat as soon as they could, content to farm and never raid again. But culture and training gave Vikings tools to function despite these psychological burdens. They created meaning from violence, honored those who fought despite fear, and built social structures that supported warriors through and after combat. It wasn't mental health care as we'd understand it, but it was something, enough that Viking warfare could continue generation after generation, despite its profound psychological costs. The decline of Viking warfare. By the late 10th and 11th centuries, the nature of warfare in Viking regions was changing fundamentally. The era of independent raiders and jarls leading private armies was ending, replaced by centralized monarchies, professional militaries, and different strategic paradigms. Several factors drove this change. First, the kingdoms Vikings raided developed better defenses, fortifications improved, early warning systems became more sophisticated, standing armies and organized militias could respond more quickly to raids. The easy pickings of undefended monasteries and surprised villages largely disappeared. Second, Scandinavia itself was unifying under powerful kings: Harald Fairhair in Norway, Sweyn Forkbeard and Canute the Great in Denmark, Olaf Skutkonung in Sweden. These monarchs were consolidating power, reducing the independence of local jarls and chieftains. Private raiding expeditions became more difficult when you needed royal permission or faced royal opposition. Christianity played a major role. As Scandinavian kingdoms converted, cultural attitudes toward violence changed. Raiding Christian monasteries became less acceptable when you were Christian yourself. Church authorities opposed private warfare and supported royal efforts to monopolize violence. Christian kings could excommunicate or religiously sanction troublesome warriors. Economic changes mattered too. Trade became more profitable than raiding in many regions. Settled agricultural communities in newly conquered territories generated steady wealth rather than one-time plunder. Vikings who became Norman lords in France or Anglo-Danish nobles in England had more to gain from stability than chaos. Military technology was evolving. Heavy cavalry was becoming more dominant in European warfare, and Vikings lacked strong cavalry traditions. Better armor and crossbows gave defenders advantages that negated some Viking tactical strengths. Naval warfare was changing, with larger, heavier ships less suited to Viking raiding tactics. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 symbolically marked the end of the Viking Age. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway and legendary warrior, led a major invasion of England with a traditional Viking army. He was defeated and killed by Anglo-Saxon forces. Just days later, William the Conqueror, himself descended from Vikings, invaded southern England with a Norman army that fought very differently. Heavy cavalry, combined arms, and feudal military organization. The Norman conquest represented Viking military evolution. The Normans were Vikings who'd settled in France and adopting Frankish heavy cavalry tactics, feudal systems, and castle building, while retaining some Norse fighting spirit. But they'd become something different: medieval knights rather than Viking raiders. In Scandinavia itself, monarchies built professional militaries, organized more like other European kingdoms. The Ledang system, requiring landowners to provide ships and warriors for royal campaigns, replaced voluntary raiding parties. Warfare became more regulated, more centralized, less entrepreneurial. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople represented another evolution. Viking warriors serving as elite mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire, fighting with imperial armies rather than in independent raids. These men retained warrior skills, but within a completely different military and political context. By the 12th century, Scandinavian warfare looked increasingly similar to warfare elsewhere in medieval Europe. Knights in armor, castles, feudal levies, siege warfare, and chivalric codes replaced shield walls, longships, berserkers, and raids. The distinctive Viking military culture had largely disappeared, absorbed into broader European medieval military traditions. But the impact of Viking warfare echoed for centuries. The kingdoms Vikings established: Normandy, the Danelaw, Norse Ireland, the Kievan Rus, shaped European history fundamentally. Military tactics, Vikings pioneered or popularized. Amphibious operations, rapid deployment, psychological warfare, influenced later militaries. The legend of Viking warriors, while often distorted, reflected real achievements. These were warriors who crossed oceans, conquered kingdoms, and created terror out of proportion to their numbers through superior mobility, tactical flexibility, and willingness to embrace violence as strategy. Modern special operations forces sometimes study Viking tactics, small unit operations, surprise attacks, living off the land, psychological operations. The operational concepts remain relevant even when technology has completely transformed warfare's mechanics. Conclusion. The reality behind the legend Viking warfare was neither the glorious adventure of Hollywood nor the simple barbarism of older histories. It was complex, sophisticated in some ways and limited in others, brutal always, but not mindlessly so. Understanding its reality helps us understand both the Viking Age and the nature of pre-modern warfare. More broadly, Vikings succeeded as warriors, not because they were supermen or had superior technology, but because they developed military systems well adapted to their circumstances. Superior ships gave them mobility advantage, cultural values produced warriors willing to face death for reputation and wealth. Tactical flexibility allowed adaptation to different enemies and situations. Economic incentives sustained warfare across generations, but they also succeeded because their enemies were often divided, unprepared, and lacking the organizational capacity to respond effectively. When facing united, well-prepared opponents with comparable military capabilities, Vikings were far less successful. Their greatest victories came against divided enemies surprised by attack from unexpected directions. The transformation from raiders to rulers showed that Vikings weren't culturally locked into permanent warfare. When settlement and trade became more profitable than raiding, most Vikings adapted. The descendants of fierce raiders became Norman knights, English nobles, and Rus princes who fought in very different ways for very different goals. The psychological cost of Viking warfare shouldn't be romanticized or minimized. Men died terribly, lived with trauma, and inflicted suffering on countless victims. The warrior culture that made Vikings effective also created violence, slavery, and destruction across medieval Europe. Whatever we appreciate about their military achievements must be balanced against the human cost. Yet, within that context, Viking warriors demonstrated remarkable capabilities. They fought with courage despite fear, maintained discipline despite chaos, innovated tactically despite limited resources, and achieved military objectives that shaped history. They proved that humans, when culturally conditioned and properly trained, can accomplish extraordinary military feats even with relatively simple technology. The shield wall, the longship raid, the berserker fury, the warrior culture. These weren't accidents or primitive savagery. They were rational, if brutal, responses to the strategic environment Vikings faced. And they worked for centuries until changing circumstances made them obsolete. Understanding Viking warfare means understanding that violence, honor, strategy, and culture interweave in complex ways. Warriors aren't just fighters, They're products of cultures that shape how they fight, why they fight, and what fighting means. Viking warriors made sense within their world, even when they seem incomprehensible in ours. So the next time you see a movie Vikings swinging an axe and screaming, remember the reality was more complex. The young man in that shield wall was probably terrified, exhausted, and trying desperately to survive while fulfilling cultural expectations of courage and honor. He'd trained since childhood, understood tactics and formations, made rational decisions under stress, and fought not from mindless rage, but from calculated aggression shaped by years of cultural conditioning. He was a product of his time, as brutal as that time required and as sophisticated as his culture allowed. And whether we judge his violence harshly or try to understand it contextually, we should at least recognize it for what it actually was, not Hollywood spectacle or simple barbarism, but human warfare in all its terrible, strategic, psychological, and cultural complexity. That's the reality of Viking warfare. Not romantic, not simple, just humans doing what humans have always done when culture, economics, and circumstance push them toward violence, trying to survive, trying to win, trying to make meaning from horror, and sometimes succeeding beyond what should have been possible.